That's all right. Let's go ahead. We can get started here. It is 7 o'clock, and we do want to value everybody's time tonight, especially because it is wonderful out there tonight. I don't know what it's like up in Indy, but it is a gorgeous night down here. So I appreciate everybody joining us tonight. Good to see you all back. First off, JD did put in our shameless SoWeLead.com website plug. So check out that link there. Lots of resources and things. Also, information coming up on the Google Field Day. So you definitely want to be checking that out. And again, tonight, we don't meet next Tuesday. That is the PD on Ice that you have an invitation for, I believe, already. And then we will meet again on is it the 23rd? If somebody check my math there. And I believe on that night, as of right now, we're looking at getting a panel of people together to talk about how to talk to students about inclusion and diversity and acceptance in this environment that we have today, and especially about what kind of language can we use when we talk about minority issues with our students. So that could be a really powerful one. That's in 2 weeks, so be watching out for that one. And don't want to forget, definitely want to check out ICE this summer, the Indiana Connected Educators Summer Conference. I believe that we are closing in, JD, close to about 3,000 people registered for the summer, over 90 presenters, over 5 days, tons of amazing stuff coming up. So you definitely want to check that out and get involved in that. Again, that is, you're not committed to all day, every day in front of the screen. Drop in, get what you need, and go. So definitely check that out. And I know several people here are involved in that. They're speaking, they're presenting, they're involved, they're planning. And so, definitely you want to take advantage of that. Tonight, I want to continue with the discussion that we've been having the last 3 meetings. And I think tonight we're really bringing in some firepower. You guys have asked a lot of questions about special ed and how to deliver those services in a virtual room, virtual classroom. And I think there's probably no one better to answer some of those questions than our guest tonight. So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Nancy Holsapple. And I'll just go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody. Tell us a little about yourself.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy Holsapple. I'm the State Special Ed Director at the Department of Education. I have been there this month, will mark my 2-year anniversary. Prior to that, I came straight from the field. Actually, was offered the job in May and took some time to wrap up. I was a special ed director in Putnam County in an interlocal. I worked with 5 school districts and started at the end of June 2 years ago at the Department of Ed. Prior to that, like I said, I had been a local director. I had been in that position for 15 years. And then prior to that, I served as educational coordinator, is what we called them, for 2 years. And then I also have 15 years of classroom experience. The only thing I have not taught is preschool. I hold a license in deaf and hard of hearing, mild cognitive disability, and emotional disability. So actually this August, I'm starting my 34th year in special education. So I have two young adult children. My son's graduated from college. My daughter is going to be a junior, and she's studying speech pathology. And my husband and I live on a farm west of Indianapolis, about an hour west of Indianapolis. So thank you for having me tonight.
Oh, thank you for joining us. We're pretty excited about having you. Hey, before we dive in, is there any and just give you a little bit here? Is there anything that new that maybe some of our special ed people here need to know about? Is there anything new policy or plans or anything to be aware of or be watching out for as we get ready for the fall semester?
Well, it's not necessarily so much the fall semester, but the Senate Bill 346 that was passed. It speaks about the accommodations and assessment, and there will be language that comes out that parents in certain sections of the assessment can choose to opt out, but that won't be effective until February of 2021. But we're working through that right now because our IEP electronic vendor at PCG, anything with software, it takes a minute to get it developed and tested and put out. Another thing that we're going to continue is the Ed Plan Connect through PCG, and that allows our families to sign documents electronically. And the hope is we continue that for moving forward. But right now, PCG has agreed to provide that service until free to the state until at least September. But we're in the process of trying to get that for the entire state. Given when the pandemic hit and schools were shuttered, everybody was trying to figure out how to, communicate with families, how to get IEPs signed, and schools were being very creative. But I had a conversation with PCG, and that was a possibility. So many of the LEAs took advantage of that. So we will continue with that in the fall as well.
Awesome. Okay. Well, the basic format here is like I shared with you before. We want to turn it over to you and let you kind of share a few of your thoughts. And then we just kind of let the conversation flow. I know that I gave you a couple of the questions people had earlier too. We can hit on those now, or we can hit them up here as we go along, either way. But let me go ahead and turn it over to you. And what would you like to share with us about delivering special ed services in the virtual classroom?
Well, I'd like to start with saying thank you to all the educators out there. The circumstances that the teachers were put into, given the uncanny circumstances with the pandemic, when I talked to educators, they were fluent in e-learning, but typically e-learning was meant to be for a day or two, considering inclement weather, not at first, the weeks at a time. And then when the governor shuttered the buildings, it went into the months. The teachers did an outstanding job in communicating with our families, making sure our students were educated. And then I also want to say kudos to the educators who also may be parents, because they had to do a balance act of providing education to their students, plus making sure that their own children were being educated. So, that was an outstanding job for so many people. So I want to start by acknowledging everybody in that sense. Overall, I think our educators did the best that they could possibly do. For some who did not have access to devices and they were trying to get packets together, and then making sure, accommodations were put into those packets, or even when they were doing the virtual learning, making sure that the students had what they needed. And to say there weren't glitches, I would be dishonest, but that was to be expected because nobody could predict what we were going into. So the teachers, the administrators, even our lunch people who are still providing food to our children. And when schools were in session and families didn't have internet access, schools were so creative in trying to get the students the access that they needed. And overall, the whole state did an outstanding job. I think there were a lot of lessons learned from it. And to be honest, if I were still in the classroom, I would have been learning right along with everyone else. What I saw through social media, it was amazing what teachers were doing to be so creative in making sure students were being educated. Uh, you know, we contract with Patton's in Indiana, and they were providing outstanding resources to schools and to families for accessibility. Because typically, if you have a classroom of students maybe with significant needs that use assistive technology or communication devices, and then when the schools close, those students may not have had the ability to take those devices home. So Patton's was working with schools and families to make sure that all students had the availability to learn. Now, I will say again that lessons learned, that, you know, moving forward, and I'm sure everyone on here has at least glanced at the Department of Ed's reentry document, and the Office of Special Ed contributed to that. But we also had to make sure that what we put in there was compliant with IDEA, and the CDC, the State Health Department, and the Governor's Office went over that entire document and made sure that what we had in there was accurate. Those are things that I could think of, you know, off the top of my head. We did have some parents file complaints against their school districts, and some of it was, I think, I don't want to say it was a malicious or an intent to not educate the students. I think those people in the districts were trying to do the best they could given the situation that they were under, and mistakes were made. But, you know, moving forward, we're going to work with the districts, we're working with the families to make sure that those types of errors don't occur in the fall when schools reopen. And if you listen to Dr. McCormick on her live, she also said that, you know, it may be a combination, that schools may go to e-learning and provide in school the opportunity for students as well. We honestly think that families will choose, for various reasons, to not send their kids to school. And that's the right of that family. You know, families were put into situations that it's really hard. And when I would have my staff meetings at the Office of Special Ed, I would reiterate to them, you know, we have no idea what families are going through, because families, you know, they lost their jobs, they had multiple kids at home trying to do e-learning, and they maybe have poor internet connection, they maybe had one or two devices, and then possibly, you know, those parents could have been trying to work remotely from home as well. So there were lots of factors that played into that. And when I told my staff, when you're communicating with schools and with families, you know, we have to take those things into consideration, because we have no idea what's going on in the homes. And just because we're educators, that doesn't mean that, you know, we're not privy to all of those other factors as well. I was talking to a special ed director, and unfortunately her husband had lost his job in the beginning of the pandemic, and we were talking about unemployment, and she was just sharing that, you know, it was taking several weeks for her husband to get unemployment. And she said, but, you know, I'm fortunate that I'm still getting paid. And as we talked, and I said, you know, there's so many situations where both parents lost their jobs. And when I've talked with Christy Berger, who's our director of SEL at the department, I said, you know, when schools reopen, we have so many things that we have to consider with our students. We have to consider trauma. So they've not been in school. It will be almost, you know, 5 months, going on 6 months before these kids get back into school. We don't know what's happened in their home. If parents have lost their job, maybe they had to go through a food line or a food pantry. Maybe they lost certain things that they were so used to, say the internet or going out or the sports, or they could very well have lost their home. So now they're living with someone, or they may have another family member living with them. So as schools reopen in the fall, that's going to have to be a key thing that as educators we have to remember. And for anyone who is a parent, when children are young, they can't always express themselves verbally, so they act out in behaviors. And I think we will see more behaviors when school starts, but we can't necessarily jump to the conclusion that that's a child with emotional disability. Article 7 defines it has to be over a period of time, and some might say, well, that's been 6 months, but we don't know how those behaviors were prior to school starting and then that time that the students were out of school. But as educators, we just have to consider all of those factors. Students could have very easily lost family members or grandparents and not being able to go through the process of grieving. That could impact those children as well when school starts. Mm-hmm. So those are all things that I've talked to my team about. So when school starts, we just have to take those things into consideration. Lisa Paddock, who works for InSource, she's had the opportunity to sit in the Office of Special Education, and she and I have weekly communications, what she's hearing from parents, and a lot of those very same things that I just touched on, she is hearing from families, especially students who maybe have severe disabilities, and now those children have been with their families 24/7, and they may not have had the home health care or the respite care that they may have gotten prior, or the teletherapy just doesn't work for those children. So those things have to be taken into consideration. Or just students who fall on the autism spectrum. We have our ranges of the different levels of autism and the behaviors that we see out of the children. So as school starts in the fall and we reopen, just keep in mind that as all children enter back into school, that it's going to be a process. And it's going to be a process for educators trying to get their heads around the new normal, if that's what we want to call this, because I think we're going to see a mix of who comes through our doors. And then if the virus reactivates, like, everybody predicts that it may in the fall, we may be back to shuttering the doors. I don't want to think that, but in reality, we have to think of all possibilities that could happen out there.
Well, speaking of possibilities, and this is a question that Nate brought, and I know we've talked about this in the past too. Do we foresee any specific provisions in IEPs for remote learning? Is that something that we want to start addressing, or do we want to keep the IEPs kind of as they are, or is there an approach that we're kind of thinking about?
In the spring, when this hit, one of the things that I had shared was, as schools were doing their annual case reviews, if you put in the narrative, because typically they will say, e-learning, if the schools were doing e-learning, they could put in there, and it was based off of inclement weather. We just need to make sure it is somehow written, whether it's in the narrative or in the minutes, that if your school would have to shutter again, or if a student or an educator would test positive and you had to close for 14 days, whatever the case may be, you have to make sure those provisions are in there so the services don't stop. So if it's in the narrative, if it's in the minutes, then you're good to go. You're not changing the setting, the placement, because in the spring, all of our students went to e-learning. So it wasn't a change of placement per se, because everybody was e-learning. Now, if you have a student or a building that has to shutter, then your school should have it in those IEPs, what the plans would be for virtual learning if that's the case. Every school had to do the continuous learning plan and send that to the Department of Education. And in that plan, the schools had to address how they would educate students with disabilities, EL students, students at risk. And in that plan, you know, schools put in there that they would do the packets, they would do e-learning, whatever was best on how the student can learn. That was in that plan on how all kids, and it wasn't just kids with disabilities, but all kids would receive their education. On that same note with IEPs, you we, when I say we, states tried to have the timeline, have a waiver consideration with Betsy DeVos, and she chose not to issue a waiver over the timelines. So the schools have to adhere to the evaluation timelines. The catch there was when schools closed. So Avon Community Schools was the very first district to close. They closed, so their timeline stopped. But then, you know, it was such a quick turnaround. So then the governor issued the 20-day waiver, and then the guidance came out for a 160-day school year. And then it came out that if you're e-learning, your timelines continue. But if you had no services, so some of the schools were taking a Monday and a Friday, and no services for any kid was being provided. So the timelines all changed, and schools had to report those days in their calendar. So if it was an e-learning day due to COVID, and that's how it was actually framed. What we found out was because of the e-learning days, those 50-day timelines continued on. So the unfortunate thing was, because the governor closed all buildings until June 30th, now July 6th, when it's proposed to open, some districts across the states or across the state is being very creative. They are saying that they're having school psychs come in July, continue with the portions of the evaluations that could not be done while they were shuttered. Some school psychs were just having families do checklists, anything that they could do that did not require face-to-face with the student. They were trying to get those pieces of the evaluations done so they would not be so far behind in the evaluation timelines. Some schools are using some of the CARES money to pay the school psychs to come in to try to catch up on that. You know, schools are just being very creative in knowing that once the doors open back up in the fall, those timelines are still ticking, and they're going to have to get those students evaluated as quickly as possible.
So the timelines are pretty set in stone as of this point, correct? That was a question that, or a statement Amy made. So,
right. Across the, you know, the United States, the 50 state directors wrote a letter with NASD, which is the National Organization of State Special Ed Directors, in hopes that it would be considered that the timelines be waived. The only timeline that Betsy DeVos was going to consider, but she makes a recommendation to Congress. So Betsy, even though she could say this is what she's proposing, Congress still has to make the deciding factor. But she was looking at the Part C to Part B timeline. So our little ones coming out of first steps into our developmental preschools. But we have not had an update from OSEP to this point on whether that was approved by Congress or not.
And is there, I assume there's probably not, since these timelines seem to be pretty fixed, but kids that are moving from one school to the next and, just getting those records processed and forwarded, or moving from 8th grade to 9th grade, from one building to the next, or, I assume that, those timelines are still set for them no matter what, right?
Right. If you have a student that attends Evansville and is moving to Vincennes, you still will have that 10-day move-in timeline to push and pull the electronic IEP. And if the student was in the process of being evaluated at Evansville, then the receiving school would need to hold when they have the move-in conference, and have that discussion with the family on continuing the evaluation or starting a new permission to evaluate. And sometimes schools want to be able to gather that data and have information on a student prior to evaluating it. But it's going to be a lot of case conferences and communication with families. Yes.
I'm going to assume, and this comes from a question that I got from Diane Dillard here. I'm assuming that a lot of this has really kind of exposed some cracks in the system, maybe like, well, we didn't think of this, or here's something new. The question, is there an option for SLD high school students who are medically fragile and need to meet graduation, but they can't attend school, and homebound is not what the parent wants? Are there other options for these students?
So the student needs to graduate, but parents don't want them home. They want them at school.
Diane, can you come in here and explain a little bit what you're thinking?
Yeah, it's not that they don't want them at home. It's that they don't want them on homebound. And so I guess I'm asking what other options there are, because the parent's pretty adamant that she does not want homebound services, but that she but her child is really not safe to come back if COVID is still, if we're still taking precautions. He's not safe to be in school.
So would the family consider the e-learning or however?
Yeah, and he did the e-learning. I guess my concern is that, we all know that e-learning is not like being in the classroom. And so, and with high school, you're meeting graduation requirements. And so I guess I'm just concerned that e-learning would not be, he already has some learning difficulties. And then on top of that, he'll need to be at home. And so, I don't know, I'm just concerned about him.
Right. We've had discussions about that, and there would be some families who choose to have their children because of medical needs to be on homebound. But then again, there are some families which it's, the education right of that child. I think if I were still in the field and that student was coming to one of my buildings, I would want to make sure that there is a health plan or a plan in place, so we know if the student would be exposed, or one of the things in the reentry is students' temperature is taken and students wear masks, and can they facilitate with a mask on? Those are all things that we have to consider when we start back to school. The one thing is, we can't just tell our parents that the kids can't come back. And that. We just have to be creative on how we're going to educate our students to the best of our ability. And I know I've seen documents on the proposed cost of the reentry due to cleaning devices needed, such as the hand sanitizer to the thermometers to the mask to shields, even the front desk, secretary, they have to have, I call them sneeze guards, but they have to have the plexiglass. So when parents come in, those are all things that are going to cost. And I think a lot of schools are using the CARES money to try to address those issues without taking that out of the general fund.
Is this changing, or will this change our definition of least restrictive environment?
Funny you asked that. We have been talking because one of the things in the reentry guidance is that students don't move from classroom to classroom. So if that's the case, the way we code our students, if it's a 51, a 52, or a 50, then it's going to have to be revisited. So if our students who would typically spend all day in general education and maybe go 1 hour to resource, is that student still going to need to go to resource, or can the teacher or an instructional assistant go into the classroom to provide that support? So when schools start looking at IEPs and thinking about how they're going to serve students, that's something that will have to be discussed, the placement on the students.
The question here was, the guidance document mentions EdPlan Connect will continue. Is that still free of charge? I think you said that, you talked about that earlier, didn't you?
Yes. Was that a director that asked?
Yeah. Amy, that was you.
One of the things was, and honestly, we had several districts who chose not to turn it on. And when I talked to some of the directors, some of the concerns were that they felt like they didn't have enough time to, go through everything to understand it. I had one director who told me, she said, Nancy, I think it's great, but I'm afraid that my teachers are going to love it so much. And then, at the time when it was turned on, we were told it would go until June 30th. And she said, and then when it gets shut off, I can't afford to continue this. So that's why I'm in the process. We have to do contracts, and I have to go through SBA to get those approval. But my goal is
it's already made. One line.
That the department would pick up that cost. So right now it's free until September. And then my hopes is then we'll just continue with it, but the Department of Ed, the Office of Special Ed, would be picking up that cost.
All right. Amy, can I pull you in here?
I'm on a conference call.
Amy, can I pull you in? Because I think I'm not sure if this is the same question or two parts of the same question, but you were asking about progress monitoring for RTI and IEPs, and also data collection. Can you kind of expand on what you were asking there?
Sure. So thinking in terms of for RTI data that would be collected, it's going to be very hard when we're in a virtual setting. So I know we can probably negotiate with our district guidelines for RTI, but still that's a big piece of the evaluation. So any guidance you would have on that, and then also for progress monitoring for IEPs, we've got teachers that are doing great things with making Google Forms, asking parents to fill them out, asking the student to fill them out. So just any additional things you have there. I think that's pretty much that question. And then my other question, and I think Nate wants to know this too, we know that during virtual learning that it's not the same. I mean, we can't, as Diane says, it's the quality is not the same. When you have an IEP that says a student is going to be maybe in a self-contained math and language arts class, 85-minute periods a day, we're not going to be meeting those minutes for the week. Is there something we need to be putting in the IEP that reflects that? I know that I was in the meeting when we had the guy from Oregon, and he talked about a kind of a a plan that you shared with the parent how you're going to meet those needs, and maybe listing some things that would be done, which I think is great because documentation could save us in the end when a parent's saying, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. So anything like that we should be including specifically other than just the statement.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk about your data collection. So when we shuttered in March until school opens back in August, it will be difficult for schools to have a lot of data. The only thing that schools have the availability to collect the data is what that student turned in. So if the student was e-learning, and this was across the state, so if a student logged in and participated, then that teacher gave them credit, or they were also counted for attendance. Or if they completed packets and they turned that in, then the teacher was able to collect the data from that. There were concerns that some of that information that was being turned in wasn't always necessarily the student's work, and that's just probably a given. If students were struggling in an assignment, the parents were probably helping. So your data points in your IEP are going to be skewed a little, and especially if you're collecting that data for RTI. What I would suggest is when school starts back in the fall, so if you had a third grader who was struggling in reading and you had that student being discussed during the RTI team meetings and you had that data, what you're going to have to do is almost start in August with the fourth grade teacher and that team looking at that student and continuing with the RTI. Because the one thing we have to always consider, none of this was a student's fault, and the students were doing the best that they could without probably truly understanding the whole issue of why we shuttered, why we weren't in school, the seriousness of the virus, and everything along that line. So when it comes to your RTI, your best bet would be start collecting data in the fall and then have that student get acclimated back to the classroom setting or whatever each district decides. And that's one of the things that Dr. McCormick was stressing, that you have to work with your local health department. So if you're in a county that has high numbers of the COVID, your starting school back in the fall may look different than maybe Knox County or Putnam County that may not have a lot of cases. So each area throughout the state is going to be a little different. Your progress monitoring. The Office of Special Ed has put out guidance on progress monitoring. And one thing that we need to remember is we cannot require families, parents to progress monitor for us. We actually had a complaint filed with the department from a family that the parents were, stating that the school was requiring the parent to conduct and gather all of the information needed for progress monitoring. So some of the suggestions could be is when you're in communication, in communication with families, you could say, how is Nancy doing with staying on task? Or you could send home like a sheet that maybe the classroom teacher is using on gathering data, and ask the family, would they be willing to do that? And if your parents say, I can't do that right now, I've got 3 kids, 2 of them are under the age of 4, and this is what's going on in my life. So then in those cases, you say, I understand, thank you. And then you take what you can from the information, the work that the student is giving you, to try to put into the IEP the progress monitoring. If you're not able to do that, then just know that when school starts in the fall, you're almost starting fresh again. You know, my department is not coming after anyone to say you did not progress monitor every student in your district. There are just so many unknowns that we encountered this spring that there's going to be leniency in a lot of the things that we typically monitor with our schools that we just have to take into consideration. It's the COVID-19. But moving forward, you know, when school starts in the fall, just plan on progress monitoring. If you're what I call a sending teacher, so maybe a student is leaving elementary and going into the middle school, you're having that conversation with that middle school receiving teacher on the strengths and the areas of concerns of that student, so that teacher knows moving forward what to look for. And in the progress monitoring, you know, the teacher who's current with that child could put in the minutes when they're holding the ACR what that student was able to do while we were shuttered at home. And then, what was your last question? You said 3 things: data, RTI, progress monitoring, and what was your last one?
I think that covers it. The other part was about minutes. So when we're doing virtual, does the IEP need to reflect the amount of minutes?
That will be reflective on when your school starts in the fall, how your days look. If your kids, if your students do not move from classroom to classroom, then you'll have to revisit IEPs to see how that is designated in the IEP. And I think it's a local decision. So we're going to see a mix of all kinds of things, from specials to, you know, I was reading through and listening to Dr. McCormick, you know, it was suggested that kids don't go to the cafeteria, that lunch is brought to them in their classrooms, you know. So there's just going to be a lot of things that has to be taken into consideration. So it will be work for special ed teachers when school starts back, that they're revisiting IEPs to see if the service minutes and the settings are accurate with how your building is set. If it meshes, then you don't have to change anything in the IEP. The one thing you don't want is if you don't address anything in the IEP and then you have a parent that comes back and files a complaint or due process and says, you know, what my IEP says and what's actually happening in school are not the same. So we have to make sure those are accurate and updated.
And if you can just answer this right quickly, I know this was a question we talked about a couple weeks ago too. If you get into those kinds of like minutes or datas or those little fine points, does that whole IEP need to be redone, or can there be an addendum? Can there be some sort of attachment to that?
What you can do, if you're changing a part of the IEP, you can revise the IEP without a case conference if you have the parent's consent. But if you're changing minutes or setting, I would highly suggest that, you know, the parent is involved in that conversation, in making sure that those IEPs are accurate. Yeah. I know, Amy, I just saw your post. It's going to be a lot of work. And I think if we start looking at IEPs, the one thing that, you know, it's almost like a catch-22, because you don't know what your buildings are going to do yet in August. So, you know, teachers can't really get a jump on IEPs and start talking about services, because we don't know yet what your building's going to do. It'd be wonderful if our doors just opened up and our kids came back to school, but reality says that's not going to happen. So we have to take into consideration all of the what ifs in case this hits us again, or schools have different formats on how they're going to provide education to students.
So understanding that you have this 3,000-foot view of what's going on, you had the benefit of looking at the state as a whole, and I'm assuming the states around us and the other directors that you communicate with on a regular basis. You said that you guys saw a lot of things. You learned a lot of lessons. What is one of those lessons that you think, okay, we got away with it, or we kind of worked through it, but here's something we need to know going into the fall? What's one thing you think we really need to focus on?
What I heard the most from the field and from families was schools were not necessarily prepared on how to provide e-learning or remote learning to kids with significant disabilities. I think our students, who the majority of them are in gen ed classes, were able to continue with their lessons with the accommodations needed and the supports that they had. The therapies were provided on remotely. Teletherapies continued. School psychs, when I had conversations with them, their concern was they were not trained to do digital evaluations. So, that's a learning process for them. But the number one thing was our students with significant disabilities. It was difficult because, I can think of students that I had, they're nonverbal, non-ambulatory, and they were in a wheelchair. Well, you cannot send a packet home and expect that kid to do it. So that was I want to say, the biggest challenge on making sure those students were educated. And I'm sure, because special ed teachers are very creative, that, thinking over the summer and while everybody was shuttered on when the schools open in the fall, how and what method can we educate our students with significant disabilities.
And so what can we say to those parents that, for lack of a better word, maybe those parents weren't prepared to be that teacher, the caregiver, the parent, the loved one, yes, but to be able to continue that process of education, they weren't ready for that. What can we tell the parents? What can we give the parents to help them with that?
The best thing I would say is, reassure your parents that we're all in this together. And since the parents have been home with their own children during this time, have that communication with the parents. Say, this is what we did while, Billy was at school. What did you see at home? And, parents are our best resources, and they could say, he really enjoyed listening. So maybe there's ways that, we could do books on tape or anything along that line, in ways that families share with us that children, especially with significant disabilities, learn the best. And then from that information, that case conference gets creative. And Patents, remember, Patents is a great resource for educators to reach out to, and they can offer supports as well.
Awesome. Did anyone have any final rounding kind of closing questions or comments?
Nancy, I have a question from Evansville, the EVSC. We are scheduling evaluations right now with our preschool evaluations. That's what we're hitting really hard, because that was a really hard group to get in. And now that we've got face shields and we've got a whole cleaning protocol procedure ready to go, we're going to be starting to bring them in. Sadly, we were not able to do our special education summer school program that we've held for many, many years. And I was wondering, with our special education grant, are we able to modify that with permission so that we could use that funding to pay for school psychs coming in, SLPs coming in, due to needing to conduct these evaluations?
Yes, my dear. If you've got money left over, and we just got an email today from OSF that we can apply for a waiver from the school year. So it's actually the 2018-2019 monies to have an extension, because typically, that's 18 months, but you can use that money if you bill and generate money out of Medicaid.
Yeah, we are trying to save our Medicaid money for the shields and for all the many different things that we may have to be, paying for that we're not normally used to or accustomed to. So that is something I'm just trying to think creatively of, like, hey, I had this money set for this specific purpose, but due to COVID, we couldn't have the summer school. So this would be a great funding source for the team that we're bringing in. And then I did want to bring up back to having parents being a part of that progress monitoring. If parents are willing to talk to the special education TOR or the school therapist, physical therapist, occupational therapist, speech therapist, and they do provide information. If they're willing to do it, we can utilize that data, correct? We just can't say you have to do it. Okay. I just want to make the comments. I was a little worried that people thought we couldn't do that, but we actually, if parents are willing, that is a data point that we can utilize.
Right. And the majority of your parents will be willing, but you will have some parents who, are just overwhelmed and feel like that's just one more thing on their plate. And they just say, I can't do that. And if they say no, then, our schools can't push that to them. Going back to your funding too, anything that is kind of related to the COVID, your hand sanitizer, your shields, your clear mask, anything can be purchased out of your materials and supplies, out of your Part B. And if you're fortunate that you have the ability to get some of the CARES money, that can be used as well. But yes, modifications can be done to help offset some of those costs.
That is awesome. My superintendent will be very excited. We hope when we return, it was a little daunting when we were home for COVID and we just had so many things happening to make those changes to the IEPs and address like virtual learning. And so that is something we're going to hit really, really hard when we get back and do PLCs within each of our schools with either our coordinator or our department chair, and give guidance on how to write those. But as we sit here and talk about, if schools make that decision, there's an A and B schedule, or that a child's going to stay in one room all day, that just makes me like sick to my stomach thinking about changing all these IEPs. I mean, it's just, I understand, but it's really scary.
It is. It's overwhelming.
Sorry, that was my 2-year-old.
That's okay. I've got a 23-year-old that walked by a while ago and was talking to me. It is daunting, but my goal is I don't want our schools to have complaints or due processes filed just because, I hate to say this, they're overwhelmed. We all know that the IEP is that legal binding document, and if it's not able to be upheld in court, then that's just very financially daunting to schools. So whatever we can do, and we try to post and update guidance and information as we get it. Like we put out, it's going to come out again this week in Sans and Pans about the altered face masks. So if kids need to look at the facial expression or you have deaf and hard of hearing students that lip read. You know, those are all resources that we're trying to get out to the field.
We've already purchased those. We purchased 500 for our district, and we've actually been like utilizing them just at home with our own children, or, you know, just they are amazing because it covers, you know, your whole head, but the child can see all of your facial expression, which is really, really important for a lot of kids.
Right. And, you know, when people were talking about what's needed, and you think if you have a child that has hearing aids, well, that's going to be difficult to use, like a cloth mask that goes behind the ears. So, you know, we're just trying to think through all different things that schools could encounter. Yes.
And these probably weren't questions that you had 6 months ago, right? I mean,
oh no,
you didn't.
No.
Yeah. Well,
No.
I want to just kind of just take a quick second here. Nancy, can you put a bow on this? What would you give as your parting shot here? What kind of advice or what kind of tip do you want to end this with?
I'm going to say that all of our educators are very smart people, and they're very creative. And what they handled in the spring will be a cakewalk on what they'll handle in the fall. Just make sure that you're prepared. And when you think through your plans, like Nicole said, you got plan A and you got plan B, you have to be able to
C and D and E.
Yeah, you have to be able to say, okay, well, this week we're on plan A, and unfortunately, because we've had some positive cases, we're now on plan B, and that means this. So we just have to make sure that we have our ducks in a row when school starts and our education continues with our students. But I have no doubt with the educators in Indiana that we won't be able to do that. So, yes.
Excellent. I want to thank you for coming. I know that, you know, you've got a tough job right now. I know that they're coming at you from every angle, asking questions that you didn't even know you needed to answer, you know. So I know that you have a lot on your plate, and I appreciate you taking this time out and joining us. I hope you didn't feel too much on the hot seat there with the questions coming at you.
No. I actually enjoy this because it allows me to get out to what I consider get out in the field. That's one of the things I've missed because I've not been able to go to any schools when they shuttered. And this gives me the opportunity to communicate with the field and hear what everybody's doing. And if there are concerns, I always said I can't fix a problem if I don't know about it. So these are things that, you know, we have to go back to the shop and say, okay, just like we were talking about the alternate mask. That's a, you know, that was in a discussion. So now let's address that. So we are trying to get through things as they come and update our information. And as we get information from OSEP, we try to get it back out to the field as quickly as possible. So
awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I appreciate Nancy for coming and joining us tonight. I think that this was really beneficial. A lot of you have got some answers to some questions you had, and I'm glad that we could provide that for you. And again, if you've got other questions, feel free to keep reaching those out. We can pass them along, reach out to each other, and make sure that you're using this as a network because a lot of us here, you know, we're all in the same boat. If you want your PGP points, the link is in the chat. So if you would please just fill that out and get your points for tonight. Make sure that you are connecting with each other. Nancy, thank you so much for joining. I thank you guys for coming tonight. I appreciate it. And that's all.
Thank you.
We can kind of wrap it up there. Thanks, guys.
All right. Have a great evening.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.